Okay, well, good evening, everyone. And let me begin by making a few sort of general remarks about the way in which the current crisis, the pandemic, is changing the nature, if it is changing the nature of the international system, and to what extent it is having an impact which is deep and structural as opposed to contingent and therefore temporary. And then perhaps I'll move on to make some further remarks about the way in which, in particular, Europe is responding to these changes in the international system. So often what is said, and what I myself have said very often over the last few months, is that the impact that COVID-19 is having is a deep and structural impact, because it is essentially an impact which is accelerating existing trends in the international system. Now, in a sense, what we do know is that the impact is, as I said, deep and structural. What we don't know, paradoxically, is precisely the direction that this is going to take. And the reason why I say so is that essentially we see two diametrically opposite trends taking place at the moment. So on the one hand, we basically see the way in which this is a crisis which is accelerating trends towards nationalism, towards authoritarianism, towards conflict, and towards deglobalization. We have seen, for instance, in the first few weeks after the outbreak of the pandemic, the way in which the national reflex, for instance, here in Europe, and not only in Europe, essentially prevailed over the international or the supranational, or in our case, the European reflex. In the first weeks after the pandemic broke out here in Europe, we saw an uncoordinated putting up of borders. We saw the attempt at restricting the export of medical equipment. We saw, particularly on the other side of the Atlantic, the attempt at a sort of winner-takes-it-all approach towards vaccine research. And we also saw the emergence and acceleration of a debate about national reshoring. National reshoring of obviously critical supplies, beginning with medical equipment, but obviously this fed into a broader debate about a national reshoring full stop, and therefore a debate that has basically been ongoing for some time and that has worked against the agenda of free trade at the global level. As I said, this is something that we saw happening in Europe, but we didn't see only this happening in Europe. We saw this developing worldwide. And for instance, there was a poll that my institute conducted, the Istituto Affari Internationali, in sort of around the third week of April, if I'm not mistaken. And what was really quite striking about this poll was the fact that there were growing numbers, in fact majority numbers, that were not only, for instance, against the free movement of people, which one would expect obviously in a time such as this, but they were also against the free movement of goods, including the free movement of goods within Europe itself. So essentially what we see is a sort of first moment in which the pandemic reignites an agenda of nationalism, which of course did not begin with the pandemic, but pre-existed it as well. What we also started seeing during the pandemic were the sort of growing sirens of authoritarianism. So of course a big debate that has taken place over the course of these weeks is which system of government is the most effective system of government to deal with a situation such as this. And of course the whole debate, particularly concerning the digital realm, and in particular, where do we position ourselves in the spectrum that separates basically liberty from security, in this case health security, for instance in the use of tracking, we have basically seen the way in which, as a sense of insecurity prevailed, obviously connected to the health situation, the tendency basically amongst publics in Europe, including publics in liberal democracies, has been basically that of accepting limitations on freedoms. And this is obviously connected to a debate about the sort of growing appeal of authoritarian models of government. A third aspect in this first, if you like, broad trend towards nationalism, authoritarianism, and conflict is basically the way in which this pandemic has been feeding the debate on deglobalization. Again, the debate on deglobalization is not a debate that began with COVID-19. It was a debate that was already ongoing, and it had started off with the big and, in many respects, very right debate on the losers of globalization and the way in which globalization had basically not worked to the benefit of all, particularly had not worked to the benefit of middle classes in developed countries. This is a debate, as I said, that had basically emerged particularly after the global financial crisis 10 years ago, and to which we have not really provided an answer. So there was, as I said, already a deglobalization debate going on. It was a debate that was then accentuated by another aspect, which again predated COVID-19, which is the push towards a decoupling of the US and Chinese economies, which of course in and of itself would represent a massive sort of aspect of a more deglobalized world, given the interdependencies between these two huge economies. And of course, the debate about the US-China decoupling connects to the even bigger aspect which has emerged very clearly over the course of this pandemic, which is obviously the US-China confrontation. Again, this is not a confrontation that began with COVID-19, but COVID-19 has given this confrontation a different twist. And what do I mean by this? Essentially, what we had already observed prior to the outbreak of this crisis was the fact that there was a sectoral confrontation going on between the United States and China. So it was a confrontation that was taking place in the trade domain, hence the tariff wars that we have been observing over the last few years between the United States and China, and then increasingly over the last year and a half, the big debate about digital, and then the confrontation over digital, in particular the confrontation over 5G technology. Now, what we have seen, though, over the course of this crisis is that now the confrontation between the United States and China is no longer and only a sectoral confrontation, but it is essentially becoming a political and an ideological confrontation between essentially the two superpowers that now look like they will characterize a G2 world. What we have also seen is the way in which this political and ideological confrontation between these two superpowers that represent basically two alternative systems of government is also a confrontation which is debilitating an already strained multilateral system. It was a multilateral system that was already strained, and one only needs to think about the blockages in the WTO or the inability of the UN Security Council to reach consensus on the most pressing political and security questions facing our planet. But on top of this, we have seen over the last few months and weeks the way in which the US-China confrontation is essentially sort of bringing almost to a halt the works of key formats such as the G7 and is harming to the point of the very existence, given that this has obviously financial implications, and finances are critical in sustaining multilateral institutions, key multilateral institutions such as the World Health Organization. So basically, sort of trend number one is, as I said, a trend in which the acceleration that COVID-19 has been pushing for has been an acceleration of existing trends towards nationalism, authoritarianism, conflict, and deglobalization. Now, having looked at the sort of glass half empty side, let me turn to the glass half full, because I think at the same time, what is also clear is that this is a crisis which is highlighting the way in which there is no other way of exiting not only this particular crisis, but I would add all challenges, all of the defining challenges of the 21st century. None of them are challenges that can be, or threats for that matter, that can be addressed effectively purely at national level. All of the main challenges, beginning with global pandemics, require international, multilateral, and cooperative solutions. Now, this, I think, if we are to turn to the sort of microcosm of Europe, is something which I think as Europeans we have started appreciating over the last few weeks. If we take the comparison between, for instance, the way in which the European Union responded to the Eurozone crisis, or even the way in which it responded to the migration crisis, in which there was a prevalence of national instincts. I think what is emerging quite clearly is that although, as I was mentioning earlier, there was the first few weeks of sort of slowness and silence and false steps, but basically Europeans have been rising to the challenge. Now, in many respects, we will see, sort of the proof is still in the pudding. We still don't quite know whether Europe will rise to the challenge, and a big part of that answer will be provided this month, later on this month, when the European Council meets to decide on the not only entity, but the precise nature, the precise form the precise nature of the recovery plan. So this is obviously something that we will be able to tell over the next couple of weeks. But it's very clear that, as I was mentioning earlier, the response so far has been categorically different from the response that has taken place in previous crises. And the reason why this has been happening has been because of the growing awareness amongst all member states that there is not a national solution to this crisis, precisely because of the depth of the crisis that we're living through. There is no way that we can get out of this by acting alone. I think that the positive is not limited. I mean, of course, the big side, of the positive is indeed a European story. I mean, I think, compared to other global actors, particularly if we look at the way in which the United States has been handling this crisis, it is clear that we as Europeans have been doing relatively well, despite the fact that in many respects, because we are not a state, but we are a collection of states, it was always going to be harder for us. And so despite this, we have been doing better. And I think this is something that is important to recognize, particularly at a time in which, or in a sort of historical period in which the European Union tends to be sort of everyone's favorite punching bag. But the positive story is not, I think, exclusively limited to the European Union. I think if one looks at multilateral formats, for instance, such as the G20, there is the beginning of an international response, which again factors in the fact that there is no way of exiting this crisis by acting in an uncoordinated manner. Let me just provide one example to this effect. It is clear that even if COVID-19 does not hit the African continent in the same way as it has hit Europe or North America or indeed South America. So even if the health crisis remains far more contained, and of course that's a very big if, given that the crisis is only really reaching sub-Saharan Africa now, and the numbers, the acceleration of numbers, particularly in countries like South Africa today, are certainly a big cause of concern. But even if, as I said, this wasn't the case, the socio-economic impact of this pandemic on the African continent is going to be, and it is in fact already, a devastating impact. If one takes the sort of collection of factors here, so the economic impact of the lockdowns, falling oil prices, which of course are critical for a number of African energy producing countries, the impact of lower remittances, the impact of lower Western investment and Chinese investment in Africa, given the economic effects of the crisis in the developed world as well. So if we take all of this together, it is very clear that there is a real risk that already fragile countries in the African continent are simply going to be unable to sustain this crisis. And I come back to the G20 because in the context of the G20, a first important decision was taken, which was basically the decision to suspend have a moratorium on the repayment of debt, not only limited to Africa, but basically extended to all developing countries. Now, this is, in a sense, a first necessary step. It's not a sufficient step because, of course, economically, what would really make a difference is an outright cancellation of debt by these countries as a decision taken by the G20. We are still sort of a far call from persuading China to this effect, but I was mentioning earlier the fact that this first decision on a moratorium has been taken by the G20 and therefore has been embraced by China as well, I think is an important signal. One last example about, in a sense, a sort of positive story about multilateralism is the effectiveness of sort of more flexible multilateral formats. And this again, to sort of cast a light on Europe, in this case, Europe's international rather than internal action. I think a positive example has been the effectiveness of the European Union in mobilizing a global pledge on the diagnostics, treatment and vaccine. It was an international pledge led by the European Union in which a number of international players participated and contributed, exceeding expectations on the pledge and therefore reaching a pledge that went over 8 billion euros. Now, so, again, coming back to my starting point, here we are faced with a crossroad, and it's very clear that the world can go in very different directions. So the question I think that we should be posing ourselves as Europeans is how do we ensure that basically the direction of travel is one that takes the world in a more cooperative, multilateral sort of direction, rather than one in which nationalism, confrontation, and deglobalization prevail. Now, let's be very clear. A big part of this answer is not provided in Europe. A big part of this answer will really depend on what happens on the 3rd of November on the other side of the Atlantic. It's very clear that in the event of a second Trump administration, it would be extremely complicated for the European Union alone to work against an increasingly nationalist, because this is what it would likely be, an increasingly nationalist United States that is obviously not committed to multilateralism at all, and a sort of Chinese commitment to multilateralism, which is, let's say, superficial at best. So it's clear that in the event of a second Trump administration, the push, in a sense, towards a negative direction would become much stronger, and possibly it would become impossible to resist. Now, in the event, obviously, of a Biden administration in the United States, the ball game completely changes, and it completely changes because a Biden administration probably would look at the multilateral domain as the first aspect in which to really determine a change with respect to its predecessor. And I think this would really be sort of, both the rebuilding of partnership and partnership with Europe, partnership with Asian partners, and in general, essentially sort of re-establishing the United States as a credible global leader, not a leader that acts alone, but precisely a leader that acts in partnership with others. So clearly it would be a United States that would still be in a confrontation with China. I don't think that we should have any illusions to that effect. And possibly the fact that it would act in greater sort of partnership with European, with Europe, with the European Union, in some respects would also make our own predicament as Europeans more difficult. And what do I mean by this? What I mean is that whereas in the case of the Trump administration, the name of the game is quite clear. Trump does not consider Europeans to be partners. It expects Europeans at the same time to side with the United States in its confrontation with China. But it seeks to achieve that objective of basically having Europeans play into the US camp through coercion, not through persuasion. And it's clear the way in which Europeans would try and respond and resist this push by building their own autonomy. It would be, in a sense, obviously a very complicated, and it is a very complicated agenda, but at least the agenda would be clear. In the sense, in the event of a Biden administration, the European predicament becomes, obviously infinitely better, but in other respects also more complex, and it becomes more complex because let me put it this way: the social contract it becomes less clear. The social contract would obviously see the Biden administration giving to Europeans in a manner in which a Trump administration does not. And what I mean by giving is one would expect the United States recommitting, both in terms of partnership and in terms of alliance with, and therefore through NATO, with Europe. But it would not be as clear what the Trump administration would expect from Europeans. Because even in the event, of a Biden administration, because even in the event of a Biden administration, one could imagine that the push towards decoupling of the US and Chinese economies to an extent would continue. It would be a selective or sectorial decoupling, and we're not quite clear what sectors we're talking about, but it would presumably be a decoupling in which the United States would expect Europeans to play along. And this would leave us as Europeans not only to continue pursuing our agenda for autonomy, but in a way which is not obviously confrontational with the United States, but in cooperation with the United States, but also defining more clearly what our own strategy towards China is. And this, in many respects, is still very much a sort of unknown question. So, in sort of, I realize I've been probably already talking too much. So let me try and sort of wrap up some of the main conclusions, and sort of zooming in a little bit more on Europe. So I think that here the distinction to be made is a distinction between the internal and the international. When it comes to the internal, personally, I am actually relatively optimistic. As I was mentioning earlier, I think that the response so far that we have seen from Europeans, if we caveat out the first few weeks of indecision, has basically been a very strong and forceful response, a response which in practice, especially in the numbers that we've been debating, the idea of a 750 billion recovery fund, these are numbers, and this is a spirit in which not only are we seeing solidarity in practice, but we could also end up seeing perhaps not a Hamiltonian moment, as some would suggest, but possibly a Hamiltonian process in which many of the defects of the Eurozone that were revealed for the first time during the Eurozone crisis, but were not addressed effectively during the Eurozone crisis, could end up being addressed in a post-pandemic Europe. So I think when it comes to the internal response, we're basically on the right track. As I said, the proof is in the pudding. Are we actually going to end up agreeing on these numbers? And above all, are these numbers, are these funds, are these policies going to end up delivering results? And what I mean by results is, are they going to engender a post-COVID economic recovery which also sees greater convergence within the Eurozone, rather than continuing to fuel the divergent economic trends that we've been seeing over the last couple of decades, so even predating the Eurozone crisis. And of course, here it is everyone's responsibility, including the responsibilities of countries like my own, that have been kind of, complaining for years about a too sort of austere European policy. Well, if this policy were to be reversed, then the economic results would have to become visible, and it would have to become. They would need to become visible through the reforms enacted by countries such as Italy or such as Spain. But as I said, on the internal front, I'm relatively optimistic. On the international front, as I was hinting at earlier, Europe really is in a far more complex situation, because on the one hand, there is the sort of autonomy agenda to be worked on in a far more complex environment because of the US-China confrontation that I've talked sort of already quite a lot about. And on the other hand, there is an additional trend, which is perhaps not one of a deglobalization, but certainly one of a more regionalized globalization in a post-COVID-19 world, which would essentially see Europeans being increasingly alone in managing the fragilities and the vulnerabilities and crises in our surrounding regions. And by surrounding regions, I do not only mean sort of difficult enough regions like, the Western Balkans or Turkey. I also mean the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, which, as I was hinting at earlier, presents a huge challenge. It presented a huge challenge pre-COVID-19, and of course the nature of that challenge increases exponentially in a post-pandemic world. So the only possible way for Europeans to square the circle is basically that of reviving and revamping multilateralism, because there is, let's face it, there is no way of effectively providing an internal as well as an international answer to this crisis by acting alone. And I'll stop here. Now, let me read perhaps and address, as I read, some of the questions that I've been receiving. So one question basically asks whether the United States will still represent an opposite and different system to that of China. Surely not in terms of sustaining multilateral institutions. Growing nationalism in the United States can be maybe debated, but de-engagement from multilateralism seems clear, does it not? Well, yes, I mean, on this question, I come back to the point that I was making earlier. I think it basically depends on who sits in the White House. And I completely agree that if we were to confront a second Trump administration, well, firstly, I would agree that today the United States is perhaps, well, it's not perhaps, it is an even bigger challenge to the multilateral system than China is, given the way in which the United States has sort of gone for the frontal attack, basically, on multilateralism. And it is also very clear, if we look also at the sort of incidents last month in the United States over the assassination of George Floyd, the way in which this is a country with very deep social divisions, which of course are not born with Trump, but basically under the Trump administration, sort of bottom-up social divisions have been compounded by a sort of top-down fueling of these divisions in a manner which has been really harming, I think, the very nature of the United States as a liberal democracy. So I would definitely agree that not only the United States today, but even more so, a United States under a Trump administration would not necessarily obviously end up with a political system like China's, but would be a democracy with very big question marks. And it would certainly be a democracy which is not acting in support of the multilateral system. As I was hinting at earlier, I think the answer to this question would categorically change in the event of a Biden victory. Where, as I said earlier, I think that basically one of the defining differences between a President Trump and a President Biden would be precisely the approach towards partnerships, alliances, and multilateralism more broadly. Another question, do you think that the European Union should adopt a reindustrialization policy as a result of the COVID-19 crisis? Well, this is sort of, in a sense, a question connected to the globalization and deglobalization debate. So yes, indeed, I believe that particularly when it comes to critical industries, and we can define exactly what we mean by critical industries. Do we only mean the health sector? Probably not. We presumably also mean the energy sector, and one can sort of go down a list of what exactly is critical. The digital sector. So it is clear that in sort of critical industries, there is the need for an industrial policy. Now, the question then is whether this industrial policy has to see everything, so basically a sort of reshoring back into the European Union. And here I would be slightly more cautious. And I would be slightly more cautious because essentially the prices would go up in a manner in which probably European consumers, once the sort of height of the health crisis is over, would probably not want to sustain. I think a healthier approach to this question, which is why I mentioned the term regional globalization, is the idea of nearshoring. And by nearshoring, when it comes to the European Union, particularly when it comes to sort of critical industries, I think is a nearshoring that would include first and foremost countries in the enlargement sort of circle, so countries in the Western Balkans. I think it would include Turkey as well, but I don't think it would stop here. It would basically include large parts of sub-Saharan Africa as well. Another question, also on the European Union. The European Union was bitterly criticized at the beginning for the slowness in action. Will we be in better shape for another crisis? Have we learned from this tragic pandemic? Well, yes, I think not only have we learned for the next crisis, I think we have learned relatively quickly also in the current crisis. Now, let's face it, the European Union is not known for being the most rapid of organizations. And despite, and this is, sort of inherent in the very nature of the European Union. But I think that despite all this, the very fact that over the course of basically 2 months, in fact, less than 2 months. I mean, if we consider the real eruption of the crisis in Europe at the beginning of March, I think already by the sort of third week of April, the EU was in a categorically different place mentally in terms of understanding the depths and the existential nature of this crisis, not only because of the pandemic itself, but because of the devastating effect that it could have on the European project itself, unless the European project effectively tackled it, led to a complete change of gear within the European Union, beginning in key member states such as, of course, Germany itself. So I think that, again, with all the caveats of, sort of ultimately the results are the ones that will speak for themselves. But I think that we're not only learning for the future crisis, but we have been learning over the course of the current crisis as well. And in fact, I think that had we not learned from the current crisis, it probably would have been too late. I don't think that the European Union could have sustained as a project ultimately 3 failures. Failure over the Eurozone, failure over the migration crisis, and failure over COVID-19. It probably would have been too much. And I think this was understood. I think this is understood, which is why I think that the response that we're trying to provide to this crisis not only would mean responding to this crisis, but it would also mean sort of dusting off the shelf the work that was left undone, particularly after the Eurozone crisis. Final question that I have here for the time being is on Italy. So Italian society has been bitterly hit by COVID-19. In the middle of the tragedy, some authors argued that there was a risky leaning towards China, due to the health equipments offered by Beijing. Is the Italian public more aware now of the European measures? And is the pro-China narrative prevailing yet, or is it more balanced? Yes, well, absolutely right. And the question has inherent in it the answer as well. I would completely agree that in the sort of first weeks of that European silence, precisely because there was European silence on the one hand, and because the United States was completely missing in action on the other, the Chinese response became very visible, particularly to a country like Italy, which, as of course you will all recall, was the first European country to be hit so devastatingly by the crisis. Unfortunately, others, obviously beginning with Spain and the United Kingdom, followed. Now, I think the sort of Chinese intervention, so the masks being sent and the medical teams, were initially appreciated, but I don't think that the Italian public was ever starry-eyed about China. I think there was always an appreciation that basically China was doing it because of its own interests, and in fact it was sort of exaggerating what it was doing through what ultimately was a propaganda effort. Now, as I said, I think that the Italians were never, not only the Italian public was never starry-eyed about China, but also the Italian government, in many respects, understood what was going on. And this is why precisely at that time, there were measures that were being taken to prevent sort of hostile acquisitions, foreign acquisitions in Italy. And this is, of course, has been part of a broader European debate. And of course, if we think about foreign acquisitions, it was very clear that what everyone was thinking about was precisely China. Now, but the deeper reason why I think the mood has changed is not because China's actions have changed, but because, again, it is Europe that has changed. You know, China's first steps were so visible and appreciated because initially there was a European silence. To the extent that that silence has now gone because it has now been replaced by action, Europeans know that it is not thanks to the Chinese that we will exit this crisis. It is only thanks to Europe itself, if we are actually able to stick together, that we will be able to exit this crisis effectively. And I think that, let me see if there's one final question coming in. Let me see also here on the, okay, there's a final question coming in. So there are two clashing narratives all over Europe, one claiming a more nationalistic approach to the management of this and future crises, whereas the other vindicating a step forward towards a stronger Europe. Perhaps the final impulse needed for a federal Europe. Which would be the requirements for the latter? Well, the requirements for the latter would be, firstly, agreeing on an ambitious recovery plan. I've already talked a lot about this. But I think just as important is the effective use of this money. So again, you know, sort of let me end on a sort of very perhaps atypical Italian position. It is up to us, and I speak here as Italian, as an Italian, but you know, obviously this is relevant also for other member states that will receive a big chunk of these funds if they are ultimately approved. And we will receive them because, of course, we have been disproportionately hit by the crisis. But then it's really up to us to make good use of this money. And it is up to us to make good use of this money in a way which puts the European Union and the Eurozone in particular back on a convergent economic trend. I think that unless this happens, or rather if this does not happen, then the effect could be a complete boomerang effect in countries, particularly such as Germany, that have made and are making an important step forward and an important reversal in its previous positions. So I think to conclude, as I said, on a very un-Italian note, I think it is going to be our collective responsibility, on the one hand, to ensure that an ambitious plan is approved, but just as importantly, to ensure that the money that eventually is agreed is going to be well spent. And I'll stop there. Lovely, well, not actually talking to you, but sort of interacting with you all.